Hey guys, Zack here, and this is my review of Danny Phantom. Okay, so this episode, Fright Night, is the Halloween special, which is fitting because I'm covering this series for Halloween. So yeah, there's a villain. In this episode, we were introduced to a villain called the Fright Knight, who, well, not the same spelling, but he is called the Fright Knight. But yeah, we're introduced to a villain called the Fright Knight, who is established to be the spirit of Halloween, which ties into the episode because this was aired like 2 days before Halloween actually happened that year. So yeah, pretty interesting, pretty cool. But in case, the episode opens up with Danny fighting an electric eel ghost, and I probably don't need to explain to you what an electric eel looks like, but you know, you know what an eel looks like. I probably should picture it, but also kind of maybe not. I don't know. Well, we'll see. But we'll see. I'm leaning toward not, because it's an electric eel. Yeah, I mean, you can probably figure out what an eel. You can Google an eel. You know what an eel looks like. But yeah. But in case, Danny is currently fighting with it, and the ghost is clearly giving him a lot of trouble because it's incredibly slippery, and Danny's having a hard time keeping hold of it because, you know, it's an eel. But he does remark that the ghost eel has some pretty cool tricks, but also points out that he probably doesn't know how to do, quote unquote, this one, at which point he uses his laser blasts, but that winds up just pissing the eel off. And that demonstrates that he does know how to do an electric eel attack. But Danny, of course, uses his ghost shield to defend himself, and the process, the ghost eel winds up getting away, unfortunately for Danny, but he winds up getting knocked into the school. He goes intangible to not cause property damage, but in the process, he accidentally gets reverted back to his human form and accidentally spills a can of paint on Dash's shoulders as he is putting the finishing touches on a poster for the school Halloween fair. And Dash, of course, is pissed at Danny for this. Obviously, he accidentally spilled paint all over Dash's shoulders and ruined one of his Letterman jackets, which we already established that Dash is like 15, so it's fine-ish. I mean, he's not gonna miss one. He can always buy another one if he has to, but he probably won't have to get to that point, because again, he's got 15 of these things. We see his closet. We know what his closet wardrobe looks like. But of course he does get angry with Danny, of course, and does get ready to beat him up. But Mr. Lancer then proceeds to split both of them up and tells them not to fight in the hallway, and also proceeds to point out that he really wishes they would put their anger and frustration and animosity toward each other into something constructive, and also asks them to give one good reason why he shouldn't give both of them detention. And of course, Dash blurts out that he's a star athlete for multiple. What we've seen up to this point, he's in multiple sports teams, but Mr. Lancer points out that even so, he is trying to be fair to Danny, pointing out that he can't show favoritism toward Dash just because, he's a star athlete. But does point out that since he realizes that they're going to need to do something constructive, he does tell them that he does have an idea for how they can, channel their frustration with each other. Pointing out that he is actually in charge of the haunted house this year. Pointing out that every year, essentially what he explains is that every year the staff of Casper High cycle through their list of teachers and staff and kind of do a bit of a lottery where every year somebody gets randomly picked, and this year it's his turn. But Mr. Lancer also points out that he wants to outdo Miss Tetzlaff, the PE teacher who did the haunted house last year. And of course, Miss Tetzlaff immediately appears as on cue and tells Lancer that he has no chance of beating her haunted house. But she does look forward to seeing how pathetic his haunted house winds up being. And of course, Mr. Lancer points out that that's exactly his point, and that he then proceeds to give them a little bit of a wager, telling them that whoever has the better haunted house room within the haunted house, which is an old abandoned, which he explains is an old abandoned house that somebody just kind of owns and abandons and no longer owns, so they just use the derelict property as a haunted house every year. So the school just kind of bought it to use it as their haunted house. But he does admit that whoever has the better room in the haunted house will not get detention. And he he looks forward to seeing what they come up with before leaving. And of course, Danny is very excited because obviously he is a half ghost, which means, you know, ghosts being spooky in haunted houses, those things should all come naturally to him. And he openly admits that he's got it in the bag to Sam and Tucker. Meanwhile, Dash is realizing that Danny is kind of bragging a little bit in front of him about how well he's going to do at the whole house, the haunted house thing. Goes on to point out that Danny is so confident about the fact that he is going to win that they might as well put a bit of a side wager on it. And of course, Danny does come up with an idea about how if Dash loses, he'll have to run around the school, streak around the school in his underwear. While Dash points out that if Danny loses, he has to eat said underwear, and then proceeds to pull out a pair of rancid tidy whities as Tucker puts it, is probably the grossest thing about the fact that he's carrying around tidy whities is that A, they're gross and disgusting, but also B, Dash for whatever reason thinks it's appropriate to carry them around in his jacket. So yeah, it's a little bit weird. But in case it's at this point where, like a week before Halloween, Danny, Tucker, and Sam start brainstorming ideas to actually find something terrifying to do for their haunted house room. And of course, Danny is trying to promote skeletons, which Tucker doesn't think is scary enough. So Danny then decides that the other way they can do it is he uses his ghost powers to turn inchangeable and make a sheet float. And he essentially drapes a sheet over himself like a ghost. Like a traditional, scary, quote unquote, scary ghost, bedsheet ghost. He does that kind of looking like a haunted wraith, which is kind of cool actually. But Sam then walks into the room, pointing out that that's kind of lame too. At which point Danny becomes frustrated because it is a week before the haunted house, and he's realizing he's got nothing to show for it. But it's this point where Sam does proceed to point out that he really hopes that he can figure something out that'll keep the spirit of the Fright Knight alive. And when Danny doesn't know who that is, she proceeds to pull out a book on the Fright Knight, revealing that the Fright Knight is this supposed spirit of Halloween who kind of haunts the earth on the 31st of October, and is the reason why we have a lot of Halloween-y traditions. And Danny doesn't really know if that's going to work, but then he sees some illustrations from the book, and what we discover is that the Fright Knight is a ghost from the Ghost Zone. So, and Danny knows this because he immediately pulls out his hand-drawn map that he's established to have been building for several episodes now, but he pulls out his hand-drawn map of the Ghost Zone that Sam and Tucker have been building, and it's revealed that they are in fact the same picture, same location, and all of that, which of course surprises them, and Danny realizes that if the Fright Knight is actually real, then maybe in order to make people terrified, he could take a lot of their his ideas to kind of adapt them into his haunted house room. And what we find out is that Danny essentially copies the entirety of the Fright Night shtick verbatim. Essentially, there's a big dummy puppet of the Fright Night just sitting in a chair in an empty hallway, that kind of looking like the throne room that the Fright Night is shown sitting in, with a lot of the Halloween-y decorations and other things. But yeah, you then proceed. But of course, Sam points out that Danny has essentially ripped off the Fright Knight, pretty much verbatim. And Danny does point out that it's cool, and he thinks that it'll really scare the pants off a Lancer, and then proceeds to use his ghost powers to overshadow the puppet of the Fright Knight that he made to make it move. Which does make it look somewhat scarier, because, you know, it's not a costume, it's actually moving on its own, which would be pretty creepy. That would definitely freak some people out. But, and of course he brags about his, of course he goes on to go on this big speech about he is the Fright Knight, and that you should wear his Soul Shredder sword because it will send you to your dimension of your worst nightmare, and that you should fear him. And of course Danny asks if that was good and if that was particularly scary, but of course Chucker proceeds to point out that since, you know, he essentially got some of the things from the dollar store, that not particularly, but in case at this point where as Danny is kind of working in the haunted house, he overshadows the Fright Night puppet, and it's at this point where his parents barge in with a new invention called the Fenton Foamer, which and they proceed to blast Danny full in the face with it. And the reason for that is because they apparently tracked Danny's ghostly energy to the house, but also notes that they can't find anything. And Danny then proceeds to insist that they leave, pointing out that if Mr. Lancer can't know, that will think that his parents are helping him if they stay, which of course causes a little bit of some alarm bells in Jack's head to go off, and he starts to wonder if the whole haunted house thing is some sort of, you know, what is it? See, they said the haunted house is some sort of detention getting out of thing, which Danny insists it's not. He just, well, it is, but he lies and says that he's just really gotten in the ghost recently, to kind of taking a tiny following the family business, which makes Jack and Maddie happy, but they do leave behind a couple of Fenton Foamers just in case anything happens, and then proceed to leave. And of course Danny, pretty happy about how his room turned out, then proceeds to wonder if the Dash's room is any sort of better than his. At which point he then proceeds to go and stake out Dash's room in the haunted house to figure out if Dash has made anything cool. And what we find out is that, yeah, Dash's isn't much scarier than Danny's, but Dash's has a much higher production value to it, because what we find out is that Dash actually despite being established in multiple episodes to not be the best student, he's apparently really good at engineering. So that's one of the things that he demonstrates in his haunted house room. He's got a lot of things that are automated and moving on their own. No strings or puppetry required. They're just little dummies that move around on their own, which is kind of cool. But and of course, Mr. Lancer does proceed to kind of praise Dash on a lot of the designs for a lot of the things he's made. And also, what we find is that Dash also has a roller coaster in his room, and of course Mr. Lancer does volunteer to take it, but also points out that his guests are going to be coming at midnight, so they need to hurry up and do it quickly. And Danny, seeing all of this, becomes dejected because he starts to realize that he may not have such a scary room after all, and he realizes that Dash is probably going to win at this rate. But at which point Tucker decides to excuse himself, and revealing that he's actually going to be leaving to go trick-or-treating. And of course reveals that he actually has his entire route mapped out to kind of increase the maximum chocolate output, so that he can, you know, get as much chocolate as he can into his system, and also has an entire block of Amity Park just kind of marked off in red. So because they just give out sweet things that aren't particularly sweet, you know, things like toothbrushes, veggie snacks, popcorn balls, you know, healthy stuff that kids don't normally want to eat. And although popcorn balls are amazing, but that's a completely unrelated point. But and to this point, but of course, Sam wonders what exactly it is that Tucker is going to go as. So he just reveals that he's just bought a pair of Groucho Marx glasses, and pointing out that having a bulky costume would weigh down his workload. So he proceeds to, you know, go out, and in the process, he walks past Maddie and Jack, who are still lurking around the area trying to find ghosts, and remarked that Tucker may be a little bit too old for Halloween. But Tucker, and from that point, Tucker has kind of a minor point in the episode because he goes trick-or-treating for the rest of the episode, and we don't see much of him. But Danny, realizing that he needs to figure out a way to do something, then goes back through Sam's book and figures out that the Fright Knight has a sword, the Soul Shredder, which that's already been established. But he realizes but he tries to figure out that the Soul Shredder is where the Soul Shredder is located, and realizing that desperate times call for desperate measures, he goes into the Ghost Zone and goes to the Fright Knight's castle, which he starts exploring to try and figure out where it exactly is. He can find the fabled weapon so that he can use it in his haunted house, and of course he starts going through the Ghost Zone and through the Fright Knight's castle. But what we find out is the castle is heavily guarded and full of traps. Case in point, there's a lot of skeleton ghosts that just kind of not necessarily threatening to Danny. Do accidentally cut him at one point, and he realizes that, which gives him a painful reminder that in the Ghost Zone, the rules are reversed, where ghosts can be hurt, and realizing he needs to be a lot more careful with the traps and other things, decides to continue through the hallway, where he discovers a massive spike trap that just pushing the walls closer together, and Danny tries to race his way through the hallway with the crushing trap. But then remembers the other reverse side of the Ghost Zone, about how and sure enough, as he's about to be crushed by the trap, he switches to his human form, where he remarks that ghosts can be here in the Ghost Zone, but humans have it made. And at which point he proceeds to continue to make his way through the rest of the castle, and eventually discovers the Fright Knight sword, the Soul Shredder, in a purple pumpkin. And of course, Danny remarks that must be where the Soul Shredder is, and it's also surrounded by a bunch of skeleton ghosts who aren't animated. They're just kind of lying there. But Danny proceeds to just kind of ignore them and plucks the sword out of the pumpkin, and remarks that it's really and does marvel in it a little bit, pointing out that this will absolutely, as a real prop, will absolutely boost his ratings with Lancer as a haunted house thing. But it's at this point where all the ghosts proceed to come to life, and Danny initially thinks they're attacking him, so he immediately turns into his ghost mode to try and defend himself. But then the ghosts start bowing, which Danny thinks is a sign of respect to him. But then it's discovered what actually is happening. The Fright Knight emerges from the pumpkin and is very happy that Danny has actually freed him. But then also requests that Danny give him his sword, so that he can use it to continue his conquest of terror and rule the world once more. And Danny remarks that he'll give it back to the Fright Knight by midnight, but also remarks that letting the Fright Knight take over the world is kind of a deal breaker. But the Fright Knight remarks that it wasn't a request, so Danny has to kind of flee from him to keep him from getting his sword. So and of course Danny proceeds to briefly fight the Fright Knight before fleeing. And the Fright Knight, undeterred, summons his horse, which is a giant ghost Pegasus, and he proceeds to sit on the horse and chases after Danny through the Ghost Zone. And Danny is only barely able to escape the Fright Knight by going through the Fenton Ghost Portal and closing it from the outside so that the Fright Knight can't get through. And initially believing that the problem is solved, he proceeds to pocket the sword. He proceeds to put the sword on his back and proceeds to head back to the haunted house so he can use it as a prop. But unbeknownst to him, the Fright Knight can actually open the ghost portal from the inside and just pushes his way out. And it winds up being a problem for Danny. But Danny, of course, then proceeds to bring the Fright Knight, the Soul Shredder, back to his haunted house room, with Sam being a little surprised that he, stole a thing. She obviously points out that it's bad that he stole the Soul Shredder, but he also remarks that the semantics about being whether it's stolen or whether it's borrowed, because in all fairness, he does remark that he wants to return it, but but he then proceeds to point out how cool it actually is. At which point he embeds it in the floor of his haunted house room, which causes a massive eruption to burst out of it, and creates an ectostorm, what is referred to as an ectostorm, which eventually is essentially this just giant storm front, but ghosts. It's a ghost storm front essentially, and And he remarks that that's cool, but that it's also probably going to help. That's probably just going to help boost the whole ratings with the with Lancer in his haunted house. But unbeknownst to Danny, it suddenly starts bringing several of Dash's props from his room to life, turning them into actual zombies. And like they were just little mannequin puppets, but it brings them to life, and they start chasing Dash around the house. And this is this point where Lancer comes into the room, and is about to judge Danny on his room and about all the decor and other things he's created. But it's at this point where Dash proceeds to run and exclaiming how he's being chased. But and he also proceeds to run through and later out of the house to escape. But it's at this point, but of course, which winds up becoming a problem for Danny again. But Danny's not really perturbed about it. But what winds up being a problem is that the lightning starts striking a lot of the things in Danny's room as well, and which turns a big box full of, little plushy, not so scary spider toys into an actual spider that ties up Lancer in its web. And Lancer points out that makes a big point that he's not easily scared in this episode. But and sure enough, giant scary spider thing. Lancer is only mildly impressed by it, and Danny does remark that it's mild. And of course, Sam insists that Danny do something and keep Lancer safe. And of course, Danny doesn't really spring into action right away because he's more concerned about winning than he is about Lancer, than he is about the whole situation with Lancer. But it's at this point where Danny, after hearing that Lancer is mildly impressed, then starts using Fenton foamers to clean up all the haunted toys and plushies and other things that are attacking Lancer, and does remark that and while Sam is a little concerned that Danny is playing it a little fast and loose with the heroics, Danny points out that it'll work out fine, pointing out that he has more than enough Fenton foamers to keep Lancer safe until Lancer declares him the winner. So he points out that he's not particularly worried about it. But and of course, this is this point where the Fright Knight then proceeds to arrive at Amity Park, and immediately starts looking for his sword, because he realizes that without his sword, as he points out, without his sword, he can't do much conquesting. But also does take note of all the things that are springing to life, and does remark that this is only the beginning, and that once he gets his sword and has full control of his powers, he will be more than able to turn the entirety of Amity Park into his own domain, and he will be able to rule over it forever. And of course, first and foremost, he needs to figure out how to find his sword. At which point he runs into Dash and asks Dash where he's running from, and Dash gives him the address to the haunted house that they were using, to the abandoned haunted house that they were using, which and Fright Knight does thank Dash for his honesty, and Dash proceeds to run off because Fright Knight is just equally as scary. But there's this point where Tucker walks up to the Fright Knight and thinks that it's Danny in a costume. Being perfectly honest, because obviously Danny at this point is established to be using the Fright Knight's entire shtick as his haunted house room. So obviously it's a misunderstanding, because he thinks that the Fright Knight is Danny because of that. And it's at this point where the Fright Knight tells him that he's not actually Danny, and also proceeds to point out that he doesn't understand what Tucker is talking about. But Tucker also points out that it's a pretty cool costume, and wonders what he's supposed to be going as. At which point, the Fright Knight proceeds to pick up Tucker and tells him that he has no mere costume. At which point he proceeds to blast Tucker's bucket of candy and turns it into a big pile of goo. Which, of course, well, specifically the pile of goo, specifically just the candy, the bucket itself is fine, and winds up being a thing because we find out a little bit more about why he can't affect the pumpkin. But we find out, but of course Tucker asks why he did that. But he also insists that this is only just the beginning, and that all the ghosts that are going to be running amok on Halloween are going to be under his control. And once again remarks that once he has his sword back, he will be able to truly make people punish people. And And so at this point where Tucker realizes he's not really Danny. But in any case, Danny is still using Danny and Sam are still using the Fenton foamers to clean up everything, clean up all the monsters that are trying to attack Lancer. With Lancer once again pointing out that it's still not particularly scary. But in the process, the Fright Knight eventually arrives at Danny's room and insists that Danny give him his sword back. And does proceed to Tucker tells Danny not to give him his sword, pointing out that if he does, he'll be able to use it to take over the world. But the Fright Knight then proceeds to just kind of toss Tucker into the web that Lancer is stuck in, and does eventually discover his sword in the middle of the room. And despite Danny's best efforts, the Fright Knight does ultimately get the sword back and regains his full powers, albeit briefly. And with that, he then proceeds to demonstrate his new abilities by attacking Lancer with it. And sure enough, is in keeping with the Fright Knight's ability, the sword doesn't hurt Lancer, but it does do something worse. It sends Lancer to a dimension where he sees his worst fear. In this case, Lancer's biggest fear is nails on chalkboard, which is obviously a very unpleasant noise, and of course specifically, his worst fear is that he is the one creating the nails on chalkboard noise, which, as an instructor, he's not supposed to do. But in case, Danny then proceeds to demand to know what happened to Lancer and what happened to him. At which point, the Fright Knight then proceeds to tell Danny that he sent Lancer to the dimension where he will see his worst fear, which Danny initially celebrates because that means he'll get a better score on his room. But then Sam gives him a look and he proceeds to go hero mode to fight back against Fright Knight, telling him to bring him back. But the Fright Knight then proceeds to very quickly attack and overpower Danny. And is almost about to defeat Danny, but Tucker then proceeds to intervene and jumps in front of Danny to defend him, which results in Tucker being sent to a dimension of his worst fear, which is being stuck on an island with no technology. Which of course, Tucker then proceeds to start panicking because that's where he's stuck. But it's this point where Sam pulls Danny into safety. But in the process, the Fright Knight accidentally Sam tries to figure out at which point Sam tries to figure out how to actually defeat the Fright Knight, but in the process, the Fright Knight tells her that the book she's reading will not save her. At which point Danny uses his ghost powers to make her intangible, so the sword goes right through her, which winds up destroying the book in the process. But not that it matters much. But Sam remarking that the bookstore she bought it from has a zero return policy, so she's unfortunately out of however much, probably $20, but is out of however much money that she paid on it. But of course, Danny, realizing that it's all his fault and that the Fright Knight is unfortunately rampaging through the halls because of him, does point out that he'll keep the Fright Knight distracted while Sam figures out a way to put the Fright Knight back. And of course, Sam proceeds to do that. Danny proceeds to keep the Fright Knight busy. Eventually she kind of combs through the remains of her book and eventually discovers a poem that essentially the poem is remarks to the Fright Knight's main weakness, and that the sword, his soul shredder, is both his most dangerous weapon as well as his biggest weakness. Because as we find out, and this was foreshadowed at the beginning of the episode, but in order to get rid of the Fright Knight, so you have to simply sheath his sword in a pumpkin. Which of course she then proceeds to tell Danny to look for a pumpkin to stick the sword in. But Danny proceeds to point out that there's no pumpkins in the room. But then also realizes he's being an idiot because it's Halloween. Of course, there's gonna be pumpkins everywhere that he can use. But in any case, he then proceeds to start looking around for a pumpkin and discovers Tucker's Halloween bucket, which conveniently is shaped like a pumpkin. But of course, before Danny can sheath the sword in it, the Fright Knight proceeds to attack him again and sends him flying through the roof. At which point they start fighting. Meanwhile, Jack and Maddie have been kind of busy with keeping the Amity Park clear of ghosts. They've been using the Phantom Foamers to save people from ghosts, from the haunted objects that have come to life. And and does proceed to wonder where all the ghosts seem to be coming from. At which point they note on one of their gadgets that there's a massive ectostorm forming over a particular address, which of course Jack naively but also kind of smartly points out that is in fact the haunted house where Danny set up his haunted house room. And realizing that their son is in danger, Jack and Maddie immediately rush in to go and save him, which we'll get to in a minute as well. But meanwhile, Danny is facing off against the Fright Knight on the roof, and the Fright Knight misses 6 times with his sword, and Danny makes a baseball joke to blast the Fright before blasting the Fright Knight with his ghost rays, which sends the Fright Knight back into Danny's haunted house room where they proceed to fight. But as Danny's and of course the Fright Knight initially seems like he's going to overpower Danny and is about to stab him with his sword, but which would of course send Danny to his worst fears, to the mention of his worst fears. But Danny merely successfully grabs the sword, and reciting the poem Sam told him about how to defeat the Fright Knight, he judo flips the Fright Knight to get his sword away from him, and then before the Fright Knight can actually get his sword back, he sticks it in Tucker's haunted house, in Tucker's Halloween pail, which works for the premise of the poem. And of course the Fright Knight starts panicking because he realizes that Danny has essentially defeated him. And while Danny just remarks that he told him that he would have it back by midnight, and tells him trick and treat, which is obviously a play on trick or treat, but you know, in this case it's a trick and a treat, so it's pretty on brand. But meanwhile, the Fright Knight scrambles to try and get his sword out of the pumpkin, but it's too late, and by this point he starts getting sucked up inside the ectostorm. His head actually breaks apart, which is actually a really fun visual, but he winds up getting sucked up, as well as his horse, but he winds up getting sucked up into the storm, and then the storm closes over the head of the haunted house. At which point, in order that they disappeared, Tucker and then Lancer proceed to return into the room, and Danny uses Sam for cover to turn back into his human form, and pointing out remarking that obviously the mention of his worst fear was probably the most horrifying thing he's ever seen. He decides to declare Danny the winner of the haunted house, which Danny very much celebrates because that means he doesn't have to eat Dash's underwear. But then realizing that he can't fully take credit for what happened, decides to come clean to Lancer and tells Lancer that he cheated, pointing out that while he doesn't go into the specifics, Sam and Tucker actually cover for him, remarking that the Fenton foamer was actually induced a hallucination in Lancer that made him see his worst fear, which isn't what happened, but they go with it. That's what Danny decides to go with. Lancer then proceeds to remark to Danny that he doesn't really care what happened and why he saw his worst fear. He just remarks that Danny is that he just has 2 scary haunted houses before his haunted house is supposed to open. And does remark that ultimately he doesn't care. That ultimately that he just remarks that now he has something to show his guests. But in case, as he opens the door to the public, he is suddenly blasted full in the face by a Fenton foamer by Jack and Maddie, which of course Mrs. Tetzlaff, once again leading her own band of people in costumes. Then remarks that that's clearly some haunted house, but also kind of mocking him about how it's not all that scary because it looks like his haunted house is supposed to be a haunted bath, and then proceeds to leave after mocking him. And Lancer, being upset that he essentially failed in his mission to make a scary haunted house that impressed Tetzlaff, then tells Danny that he's actually lost and is going to be that he'll see him in detention, essentially to spite Danny for ruining his haunted house, and specifically his parents for ruining the haunted house. At which point, Jack and Maddie. Jack figures out that his assumption was right about how Danny was using the haunted house to get out of gang detention, and tells him that he's in a lot of trouble, which Danny remarks that they don't even know the half of it. At which point, it then cuts to the next day, where Danny, in front of everybody, Sam and Tucker provide him with salt and pepper, but Danny, in front of everybody, is forced to eat Dash's rancid underwear. and he proceeds to vomit inside his mouth as the episode ends. So overall, a pretty fun Halloween special. I do like this episode as a special. It's pretty fun. I do like the Fright Knight as a villain. He's pretty cool. Because obviously, spirit thing of Halloween. And obviously he inadvertently and once again, Danny is the one who ultimately escalates the situation, because again, he's more obsessed with winning the haunted house thing and not going to the detention and having to eat Dash's underwear than he is about and he's so concerned with that he causes the Fright Knight to be set loose on Amity Park. Obviously, that is Danny's fault. That is the big thing. And but he does wind up making up for it, though. I'll be perfectly honest. He does return the Fright Knight back to where he was supposed to go, and of course Danny is insistent, and of course he does make up for it by learning that he can't really take full credit for what happened, because obviously he really made a mistake by letting the Fright Knight loose. But overall, yeah, I do like the episode. It is a fun Halloween special. And fittingly on brand for what we're doing. We're reviewing the series for Halloween, so it fits what we're trying to do. But yeah, that's gonna do it for today's episode. So yeah, thank you guys so much for watching today's review. If you enjoyed, be sure to like, comment, and subscribe. Also, be sure to follow me on Twitter in the description below. Be sure to check out my Discord, because we are going to be doing a horror movie watch-along thing at the end of the month. Like Halloween weekend is when we're gonna be doing that. So I hope you guys will absolutely go join that and go hang out. But yeah, go do that. But also be sure to go and check out my Twitch. Link is down in the description. We are streaming horror games up until that point for the entire month of October. I already have this weekend's ones picked out, so I hope you guys will go and hang out and do that and observe all of those, because I would appreciate that. But yeah, go do that. But yeah, in any case, go hang out over there. I would appreciate that. And also be sure to go and check out my Patreon if you want to help support me. Patreon has done a rebrand, but it's the same usual place that you would go to for. I don't like the rebrand for Patreon, being perfectly honest, but it's the same usual place where you would go to support me otherwise. So please go do that. Go check that out. And finally, if you want to see more content from me, then check out the playlist link in the end screen. The top playlist is the most recent of these that I've done this month, which I did to celebrate my birthday last year. I'm very proud of that one. And it's also stars probably one of the more underrated Cartoon Network shows that unfortunately got done dirty and was canceled. But yeah, and then the bottom one is Courage Month, which of course was the first one that I did of these, and it is more traditionally Halloweeny. So go check that one out. But in any case, thank you guys so much for watching. Next time I will see you guys in the next video. Peace.